This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel, broadcasting remotely. Today we talk about how cities in Connecticut can thrive despite the challenges that continue in the pandemic. Small businesses are the foundation of the local economy, from providing jobs to creating community. We'll hear from New London's Director of Economic Planning just ahead, and we'll talk to Ken Greenberg, an urban designer based in Toronto. What should leaders consider now and in the future to help urban renewal? First, we wanted to check in on how the Westville neighborhood is doing. It's part of the city of New Haven. Joining us now on Zoom is Lizzy Donius, the executive director of the Westville Village Renaissance Alliance. Lizzy, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Lucy. It's great to be here.
You can also join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Lizzy, I mentioned you were on the show before, back, I believe, in the fall of 2019, talking about the importance of Main Street retail in towns and cities. And so now, more than a year later, we're in a completely different situation. First, for our listeners, describe Westville to them and what's been happening the last several months there.
Okay, sure. So Westville is a small commercial district in the city of New Haven, and it's home to a lot of neat little independent stores and dozens of artists and art galleries and studios, and increasingly a wide array of restaurants with food from all over the world. Westville is a really warm and inclusive and arty place, very family friendly and with a strong sense of community. So it's just a neat little neighborhood. And we had growth when I was on last year. We talked about some of the exciting growth we were seeing. And so some of those projects, 5 separate restaurants opened during the pandemic in Westville, which was really, really exciting. Not to minimize the challenges that all of our stores and restaurants face as well. But we have seen some growth in the last year.
That's amazing to hear that there were 5 restaurants that opened in the pandemic.
Yeah.
So how are they doing, Lizzy?
Everybody's doing well. Everybody could use customers, takeout customers, whatever people feel comfortable with. But these are really brave entrepreneurs, putting it on the line in a really difficult time. In several cases, investments have been made prior to the pandemic, and the decision was to, finish the work and move forward. Delaney's restaurant, which had been a huge anchor in the Westville community for many, many years, and burned to the ground in 2014, causing a lot of economic trouble for our whole neighborhood. Those guys were able to reopen in a new space, and they were ready to go in March, and just moved forward, in maybe May or June, and they've been doing wonderfully. Camacho Garage, which is a Arturo Franco Camacho restaurant, is a really well-known chef in Connecticut. They'd owned a building in Westville for several years and been working slowly on opening it, and they kind of sped up with the extra time that they had and were able to open, and that's now a huge anchor for our neighborhood. And several of the littler places, they were just ready to go. So it's been exciting. People are doing a good takeout business. They're working with the restrictions for indoor seating. And everybody's just hoping to hang on and do well, when we're all ready to go all the time.
And what about the businesses that have closed in the Westville neighborhood, Lizzy?
We haven't seen a lot of businesses close. So we had one salon that did close. We have several salons in Westville. Those are some anchor businesses for us. We have one salon that closed, and then Neville Wisdom, who's a wonderful fashion designer here in Westville and in New Haven, he moved downtown. He had 2 locations, and he consolidated them into a location on Broadway. It's like a very visible, neat move for Neville. So we lost Neville to downtown, but we're okay with that. And our anchor in Westville, a lot of studio has taken over that Neville Wisdom space. So they're going to expand their co-working and their photo studio into that space. So, we have actually done very well in Westville.
Mm-hmm. We wanted to talk with you today, Lizzy, because of the fact that Westville is an interesting neighborhood because you have mixed uses, people living there, but also a commercial district that's thriving, or there's been work to help bolster that over the years. But can you talk more about what makes this neighborhood special and the people that live there?
Sure. Westville is an incredibly special place that, focusing on the commercial district, we have many artists who live in the commercial district of Westville, live and work. Historically, we have some below market rate housing for artists that's helped make that happen through something called the Artist Lofts West. We have, there's the Westville neighborhood that borders Westville Village, but we also have 4 other neighborhoods that are walking distance to Westville Village, including Beaver Hills and Amity, Edgewood neighborhood, West Rock, so that, it can be an anchor for the entire west side of the city, and that helps drive traffic. So at WUVRA, the organization I run, we've focused on, keeping that commercial district vibrant and diverse and healthy so that we can drive all of those people into Westville to walk, to shop, and to be a part of the community. And we do that through a really, really robust slate of community events that we do every year, which has been a little bit different this year, but we have an art walk, we have a pie baking competition / summer concert series, a giant puppet parade. There's a strong sense of belonging in the Westville community.
And so that foot traffic has continued, even though the pandemic has brought on new challenges, Lizzy?
It has grown. So I think that's interesting. We have worked really hard for many, I think, decades at this point to increase the foot traffic in Westville, like all main streets. That's been a huge issue for us. So we have worked really hard to see that and grow that increase. I think one reason that we've seen an increase in the pandemic is that Westville is a small area. So in terms of people's comfort level with where they might shop or visit one restaurant or spend a little time outside, we're between 2 beautiful parks. Westville's a great place during the pandemic to be able to go and feel like you can keep yourself physically safe, but be a little bit more part of the community.
This is Where We Live. On Zoom with us, Lizzy Donius, the Executive Director of the Westville Village Renaissance Alliance, as we talk about how commercial districts and neighborhoods are trying to stay connected but also thrive despite the pandemic challenges. What's going on in your neighborhood? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And so I'm curious if you could talk more about the fact that New Haven has a lot of great shops and restaurants throughout the city, and how that can impact the foot traffic and the visitors that come to Westville, Lizzy.
Yeah, I think, increasingly we're seeing more new faces in Westville, which is wonderful. It is a tight-knit community, so we know we're succeeding when there's people waiting online outside Bella's Cafe or our new Cafe Pistachio. And I won't know who any of those people are. They're coming from all over the city. So I think word's getting out about some of the exciting new places in Westville, and people are looking for places to explore. So we're seeing a lot of interest from around the region, which has really been wonderful. One thing I wanted to add for us, and I think this is true for many businesses downtown as well, is that we have embraced, and our businesses have embraced, a lot of hybrid models. So a great example of that would be the Strange Way shop in Westville, which sells pins and patches and flair. for jackets and that kind of thing. And I checked this morning, they have 64,000 followers on Instagram. So Alex DeCoulis, who owns that store, does a great online business. And then he also has a following of people that will come to Westville just to visit his store and then discover the neighborhood. So in this time where the brick and mortar is so challenging, we've seen a lot of our businesses lean into that digital presence or learn that digital presence, which has been wonderful.
Speaking of businesses in Westville, joining us now on the phone is Melissa Gonzalez, the owner of Vinanthro Modern. It's a vintage clothing shop in Westville. Melissa, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you. Hi, everyone.
So tell us about your shop and what it's been like to operate in the pandemic, Melissa.
Yeah, so Vinanthro Modern is a combination vintage shop and small batch handmade goods shop. We carry a lot of local artisans in addition to our inventory, which is primarily vintage, but also has some modern designer components. And we've been in Westville. This is our third year in Westville. Previously, we were in another New Haven neighborhood called East Rock. And during the pandemic, we've had to pivot quite a bit to keep our doors open and, to keep our bills paid. A lot of that includes social media. We do a lot with Instagram and Facebook. We've done a lot of live sales. We have an Etsy shop. And we've really tried to diversify what we have to offer and the ways that we have to offer it to stay relevant.
Now, were you doing some of that before the pandemic hit? Did that help you, Melissa, where you had a following online as well versus just relying on foot traffic?
We started out as an online business several years ago, and we used to have a roving vintage shop on an old shuttle bus and do pop-ups. But once we transitioned into a brick and mortar presence, we sort of, relied less on those features. But when the pandemic hit, we sort of felt that, even though it takes a lot more time to do things online and there's sort of a learning curve, that it was something we really had to buckle down and do. And of course, once we started doing it and got the response that we got, it seemed like second nature to us. And we've really leaned into that over the past, 6 to 8 months.
Has it been a struggle at times, Melissa? Are you worried about the future months as we see cases rising?
Yeah, definitely. I think, once we got through the first wave of the pandemic, we sort of breathed a sigh of relief. But unfortunately, now that we're, in the second wave and things are very challenging, we want to protect ourselves and protect our customers. And so, we are maybe not as accessible as we were. So, we definitely have concerns about, we're a fairly small shop. We can only have about 5 people in at a time and still maintain social distancing. And so, of course, on weekends in Westville when things are really, really busy, it is a challenge to make sales when you can only have 5 people in at a time. And, many times there's a line at the door and, that can be a little tricky. But, we're doing the best we can, and we're lucky to be in such a positive and supportive community. And so, we count our blessings with that.
Tell me more about that, Melissa, because we hear so often about small businesses struggling and location obviously does matter. Talk about the fact that this is a close-knit community and what are you hearing from your customers?
As I mentioned before, we used to be in another neighborhood in New Haven that didn't have such a close-knit group of business owners, and I've really noticed the difference that you never quite feel like you're alone in this, and just being able to walk a few doors down and get a coffee and have conversations about how business is going or brainstorm ideas or even collaborate with other business owners on promotion or ways to strengthen business or strengthen the community is just really something that is invaluable. And I don't feel like I'm on an island with my business. And I think that is key to small businesses succeeding is having other people around that not only support your business with their own dollars, but also with their own dollars, but also with ideas and just conversations about how to make things better or how to get through it.
That's Melissa Gonzalez, owner of an Anthro Modern in Westville. Melissa, thanks for calling in. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying the show this morning.
Lizzy, Donius is still with us, Executive Director of the Westville Village Renaissance Alliance. You talked briefly about the artists in the Westville community. We know that artists are struggling when we think about a studio space as well. Can you talk about how artists are working through the challenges and what you're seeing in Westville?
Sure. I'd love to echo what Melissa was saying about the community of business owners. I think that goes for the artists as well. And those communities are kind of, integrated with each other, so that there does feel like there's an ecosystem and a supportive community there that helps people feel less isolated in this time. So the artists are struggling with many of the same issues that the retail businesses are struggling. I think of them as small businesses because that's really what many of them are. So, they are looking to connect with the people who are interested in their work and supporting their work and stay in a mental space where they can do their work. And at Woodrow, we focused on trying to direct resources and support that we know about to those artists and think of them as small businesses as well. So we did something in the spring where we raised money through our virtual Art Walk event and through the Great Give at the Community Foundation for Greater New Haven, and took all that money and made a small business fund and made small grants to our retail businesses and also to independent artists and other entrepreneurs that are working within Westville. And I think that the money was helpful, but also the support from the community meant a lot to people. That money came through mostly like individual donations from people who appreciate the community that we've created and the work that people are doing. When
areas become desirable and hip, you can see rents increase and people who've lived there for generations being pushed out. How is that being approached in Westville so that it does not become an issue, Lizzy?
This is something we are thinking hard about. This is a problem I knew could be a problem, but thought might be wishful thinking. Having the rents be reasonable in Westville for the shops and for the people who live in our mixed use area. We have new apartments hopefully going in as well. As we grow, we are really committed to trying to keep our ecosystem as it is. If the rents in Westville were higher, frankly, we would not be seeing what's happening right now and what has been happening. A lot of why Westville is succeeding and why we have, an independent record shop and these kinds of, and Melissa's business is because you can afford to have a store in Westville. Try something new, build it, grow it. And it allows us to have a diversity of businesses, a diversity of people who come to Westville, and a diversity of people who live there. So this is super important to us. I think, it's hard to gauge what Westville is going to look like when the pandemic is over, but we are committed as a community to making sure that we don't undo all the success we've had by running everybody out.
Well, we want to check in with you again. Lizzy Donius is Executive Director of the Westville Village Renaissance Alliance. Lizzy, thanks for coming on.
Thanks, Lucy. I actually have one more thing I wanted to say because it is exciting. Our story is very exciting, but I do, as an advocate for a commercial district, just want to make sure that I say out loud how important the federal aid and the aid from the DECD that's coming, how important those grants and forgivable loans are, that's the critical piece that's kept people going, and everything that we do is helpful. But that I really believe that money is necessary during the pandemic to make sure that all of these places are here when it's over.
Thank you, Lizzy. Donius, again, the Executive Director of the Westville Village Renaissance Alliance. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Coming up, we talked to Ken Greenberg, an urban planner who has worked all over North America and Europe, including in the city of Hartford. You can join us too. How should leaders look to remake urban life? You can join us at 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We just heard how one Connecticut neighborhood is working to keep residents and businesses thriving despite the pandemic. How can cities weather this current crisis and use this moment to improve urban planning? Joining us now on Zoom is Ken Greenberg. He's an urban designer and city builder, principal at Greenberg Consultants. That's based in Toronto. He was a consultant for the city of Hartford in the late 90s, looking at a redesign, starting with the downtown area. Ken, welcome to our show.
Good morning.
So we talked a little about Westville and what's working in that community. As you were listening, what are some of the elements of that neighborhood that you think are really important when we think about moving forward and how to keep cities and neighborhoods thriving, Ken?
So it was really interesting to listen to Lizzy and Melissa talk about Westville, because in a sense it illustrates a much larger phenomenon that's going on, which is, I won't say the rediscovery, but the acceleration of the value of the neighborhood, place we live. There's a lot of discussion these days in the world about the 15-minute neighborhood, the 20-minute neighborhood, the place where you can find all the necessities of daily life, where you have, as they were describing, an ecosystem, where people know each other, where they support each other, where you can walk to things, where you don't have to get into a car and drive to some remote place distant from where you live. And in an interesting way, COVID-19 has ended up being what some are describing as a particle accelerator, pushing us to overcome a lot of the things that were problematic in our world, and use our cities differently. So walking in public space, we've never seen, at least in my world, people using parks as much as they've been doing lately. People just walking on the street because that's the kind of exercise we can get. People trying to be sociable even as they're kept distant. And I think the stories about Westville were really illustrating that idea.
When we look at how cities have evolved, Ken, so much space allocated towards cars. And when you're talking about with the pandemic, more people using public space and parks, I know that cities, including local towns in our state, trying to experiment with closing down some of our streets to help with businesses and social distancing when the weather was good. But now that it's back to winter, these streets have gone back to use for cars. And I'm just wondering if you could talk more about how, when we think about urban design and making areas more welcoming and more inviting to people to come in, not just to drive through.
So in 2011, I published a book called Walking Home. It was all about getting us back on our feet and dealing with the way we changed the urban world in the generations after World War II, when we all embraced the automobile, when we spread out, when we developed And I was tracking in city after city, including Hartford, where I had worked previously, the move back to the city. And as I've said, what we're now seeing is very, very quickly, almost spontaneously, city after city around the world moving more quickly, reversing that trend. And as you say, taking away lanes of traffic. In Toronto, we have this thing called Cafe TO, where we had something like 450 restaurants who were allowed to take a traffic lane in front of their restaurants and cafes and set up outdoor seating. We've seen all of a sudden 40 kilometers of bike lanes installed that we were trying to do, but doing very slowly and very cautiously. And my prediction is that as people have, in these last 10 or now closing in on 11 months of really difficult life, as they have experienced this increased use of public space, they're not going to give it up. This is something that we are really enjoying. We see the benefits of. And so this shift away from, it wasn't just being in our cars, but what the cars did, it is separated where we live from where we work, from where we shop, from where we went for recreation, for cultural uses. And again, I'll go back to Westville, the kind of integration, the tightness, which was a phrase that Lizzy and Melissa were using of that community, the fact that people were communicating with each other. In a sense, we've come back to our senses. We've realized that period, those generations after World War II leading throughout the 20th century was kind of an aberration, and we had lost track of things that really mattered.
Mm. Now, we are right next to New York City, and during the pandemic, Ken, we heard about a lot of people moving out of New York City and finding communities to live on the western side of our state. What did it look like in Toronto? Because people, maybe they didn't want to be in the city during this virus. I'm just curious what you saw up there in terms of people's mobility.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk. I'm going back to last March when we first had the lockdown about what would the impact be on the city. There was an article in the New York Times about New York that said that density was the enemy. I think there was a huge confusion between density and overcrowding as that affects infectious diseases like the pandemic. You can have overcrowding at very low densities. Cities, and we saw, for example, the low rates of transmission in Asian cities that were extremely dense, more dense than places like New York. So people have kind of realized what the problem was about cities. We've had some in Toronto, we've had some of that moving out. People, for example, people have cottages in the areas north of the city, and some people who had summer places have gone to live in those, but it hasn't been a huge number. What it has done, though, is a kind of what I think is positive dispersal throughout the city region, and you might take the region around New York City, including Connecticut, possibly northern New Jersey, and the areas north of the city in New York State. People going to smaller towns and cities which are actually benefiting from an increased population. And rather than all concentrating in a kind of radial fashion on converging on one huge business district through commuter rail or other forms of transportation, spreading out a little bit. And this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually given life and vitality to some of those smaller places, which had a lot of great infrastructure available for people to use.
You're listening to Where We Live as we talk to our guest on Zoom, Ken Greenberg, urban designer and city builder, principal at Greenberg Consultants, about the future of cities as we've all been living through this pandemic. Is this a moment that leaders will take to really start to address inequities and to remake urban life, to make it more equitable for all? You can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Ken, we're having a little trouble hearing you on Zoom. If you could just sit a little closer to your microphone, hopefully that remedies it. I wanted to ask you, what about the people that can't move? When I talked about how the pandemic has really highlighted our inequities in our society and ways to help people living in cities that may not be able to just move out if they feel like there are health concerns, but maybe providing more affordable and stable housing and improving public transportation. Are these some of the things that you hope to see moving forward?
All of the things you've mentioned. I think in the same sense that COVID has been a particle accelerator, it's also shown a very harsh light on those deficiencies, those inequities, the polarization that we had allowed to happen in our communities. So if anything, it's putting more emphasis on access to transit and parts of our city that have had inadequate access. It has shown a huge light on lack of affordable housing and the fact that we're relying on people whom we now call heroes, the frontline workers, people in working in grocery stores, people delivering goods who were not able to live in the hearts of cities because they had become too expensive. And so this has really pushed people in the world that I'm in to consider things like inclusionary zoning that would require affordable housing in all new development. A huge emphasis on the way we care for seniors in long-term care, what you would call nursing homes, which have been hit so hard, inadequate pay for people who work in those facilities who have been forced to take multiple jobs, making themselves and the people they're caring for even more vulnerable. So my hope and belief is we will come out of this period no longer taking for granted that the systems we had were working, because they weren't, and politicians really embracing the fact that they need to do something to remedy those problems.
This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Ken Greenberg and also hear from the City of New London about its approach to help with urban life. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. We've been speaking to Ken Greenberg, urban designer and city builder, principal at Greenberg Consultants, as we talk about this moment that city leaders can take to renew urban life while also addressing inequities in this pandemic. Joining us now on Zoom is Felix Reyes, Director of Economic Development and Planning for the City of New London. Felix, welcome to the show. Felix, are you there? Felix, can you hear me? Okay, oh, there you are. You gotta love Zoom on the Monday after a long holiday break. Felix, you can hear me now?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
So I'm wondering if you could respond to some of what Ken has shared with us about this moment in time when we think about urban design and moving cities forward in their thinking about planning, but also addressing inequities.
Yeah. So in listening to what Ken was saying, it's funny as he was describing the different, I would say, the pandemics, the what the pandemic is actually causing and the effects to our businesses, to planning, how development happens, how population is shifting and moving from the larger cities. It's funny, in New London, we're seeing that in real time. Every day, I'm witnessing this population kind of shifting from the larger cities, and people choosing a city like New London, which has a high density, it's very diverse, has a huge range in socioeconomic. It's a cultural district. Has large industries, has a waterfront, has parks, all the things that you'll find in a larger city with a little bit less people, but a lot more affordable. So what we're seeing is in the last data that I received from local real estate agents is about a 40% out of state population of buying real estate in New London. So all new homes, commercial properties, about 40% is coming from out of state. A lot of people from Brooklyn. We're seeing people buy homes sight unseen, which, I mean, you rarely see those kinds of things. People are getting what they're asking for or above. But if you look at it, if you think about it, I mean, a home in New London, you can get a 4-bedroom home for $250,000. And with the ability to work from home now, and having kids who you perhaps have to stay home and do virtual schooling with, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. People are there's businesses that are allowing folks to work from home, and we have residents that work for Google in California that moved to New London, and they're allowing their workforce to work from home for the next year or two. So those are things that we've never seen before, but that's the shift that this pandemic is creating in regards to population. So a lot of the things that Ken mentioned is absolutely true. So we're seeing those things in real time.
So when we think about the New London before the pandemic began, where did you see areas that needed to be improved when we think about economic recovery and parts of your city that have not been developed?
Yeah, so I mean, our central business district, our downtown, is a beautiful historic area that has struggled for generations. I think people have scratched their head for years trying to figure out what is it about downtown that we're having such issues growing. We're having low rent, low rental the inventory is kind of in bad shape. Occupancy is low, foot traffic is not where it should be. So prior to the pandemic, a lot of the things that we worked on were really incentive based. And if you look at New London, we're 5.5 square miles, and our central business district was originally designed to be a regional business district. So what I've come to conclude is that our central business is just too big for such a small city. You've got some neighboring towns that have main streets like Mystic. You talked about some areas in New Haven earlier in the show, but they're a fraction of the size. So we have everything that those downtowns have. We have the ice cream shops, we have the barbershops, the salons, the independent record stores, the bookstore, restaurants. We have all that, but they're spread out in a much larger business district than other downtowns. So it gives this illusion like, wow, I see all these empty storefronts. And I tell people, we just haven't grown into the set of shoes that we're dealt here. So when we kind of just come to that realization, what we've done was a couple things. Number one, you've got to look at your planning and zoning regulations and understand what's hindering growth. So we made some text amendments in regards to parking, in regards to being able to create new apartments in downtown. And you have to bring in just a different type of population and not just rely on commercial industry to occupy your downtowns. So we're doing that. We're seeing growth in that. And a lot of the things, I go back to what Ken said, talked about foot traffic, talked about, increasing your bike lanes. Those are all things that we're doing and have done and seeing some real benefits from that. But again, this is my third year with the city of New London. And, we have a plan that essentially sees the downtown get back on track. It probably takes another 5 years. That was pre-pandemic, but we're hopeful we can get back on track within the next 12 to 18 months.
I wanted to bring Ken Greenberg back into the discussion again. He's an urban designer and city builder. Ken, we were listening to Felix talk about New London, the good news that people from out of state have been moving and buying homes, but the downtown corridor is still a challenge. That is a similar story for a lot of smaller cities. What's your reaction to New London's plan moving forward?
Yeah, so it makes me think of the time I was working in Hartford and what we were struggling with. Hartford had wonderful Olmsted Parks in the downtown. It had a great historic core. It had a railway station. It had some cultural amenities. It had Trinity College. And yet, halfway between New York and Boston, it was really struggling. And I think this is the moment when the virtues of the smaller, the mid-sized cities come into play. So I'm going to give you a bunch of adjectives which I think describe what people are looking for now. Diverse, inclusive, affordable, green, walkable, sociable, bottom-up as well as top-down, rich in amenities, and economically productive. And I think if you can provide and market those things in your town or city, this is the moment when what we've learned about the virtues that I was describing before of the 20-minute neighborhood, the 15-minute neighborhood, which is mixed, which is diverse, which enables you to do all the things or most of the things you need in your daily life without getting into a car. You have the winning conditions. Those are the places that people will gravitate to. And not only is it happening in historic cities and towns, but what's interesting is that in parts of suburbia where the whole world revolved around power centers and malls, the owners of those malls and power centers, the very people who created them in the Toronto region, are actually turning those into neighborhoods now. They're actually colonizing the huge parking lots. They're tearing down the malls, and they're creating these mixed-use neighborhoods. So this is an extraordinary shift, many features of which are really positive, that's going on at the moment.
That sounds really interesting, Ken. This idea that also Felix mentioned about having to change some zoning laws, but not everybody is on board with that in specific communities. And so how do we address that challenge where zoning can be changed to include both residential and commercial, but to also make sure it's still affordable?
Yeah, the affordability is a huge issue. You had mentioned in the earlier conversation with Lizzy the whole issue of gentrification, and it's a huge one. And if we don't address that at the same time, I think it's a huge failure. So strategies like making sure that we build in requirements for affordable housing wherever development is occurring are absolutely critical. There's huge inertia in the existing regulations, and I was interested to hear that Felix is talking about changing them. I live in an area of Toronto. I don't know if your listeners will be familiar with Jane Jacobs, and great writer on urban life, Death and Life of Great American Cities, published in 1961, is really a central read for anybody who cares about cities. So I worked with Jane when she lived in Toronto and with our mayor of the time, and in two areas flanking downtown, 400 acres, which had been formerly industrial areas, the zoning didn't permit any legal residential. We simply removed that restriction and almost within a very short period of time got 50,000 housing units occurring in these areas, a population of over 100,000. By allowing people to repopulate a lot of the warehouse buildings that were being torn down for parking lots. Zoning is a powerful tool. It can be undoing a lot of the prohibitions in zoning can be a very creative way of inducing change.
Felix, I wanted to go back to you again. Felix Reyes is here. He's the Director of Economic Planning with the City of New London. Ken shared some adjectives of what people will be looking for and how cities can respond. Can we talk about diversity? Because New London, this is a diverse area, and I'm wondering how that has attracted people to New London.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in diversity, it's much more than just, race and economic background. I mean, we're talking a diverse talent. We have a huge cultural district, arts community in regarding age from senior citizens. We have a robust school system. It's a magnet school that attracts kids from around the region. So diversity hits on many levels in the city of New London. But yes, I mean, I think one of the things I remember, I was asked to do the speech at a graduation when I started working for New London for the high school students. And one of the things I mentioned was, my success, I'm a New London product, by the way, so born and raised in New London. And I said, my success in the corporate sector when I worked there had a lot to do with growing up where I had, an Indian family in front of me, a Jewish family to the right, a Black to the left. And that's New London. The sights and sounds and the smells and the culture are extremely diverse in the music. So one of the biggest things is point of view, right? So when you have a lot of diversity, you have a lot of ideas, and that makes, planning, it can make it very fun. It's interesting. It can make it difficult at times, but education is always key when planning in a very diverse neighborhood, especially folks that are concerned about how the city is addressing gentrification. And I'm glad that was mentioned because I always say, if you ask 10 people to define gentrification, I will tell you, you're going to get 10 different answers because a lot of it has to do with how it affects you personally, is what I've seen in the conversations that I've had with residents and neighborhood leaders that want the issue addressed. And yes, as mentioned, zoning can play a role in that. We've got a lot of development that needs a lot of tax abatements and credits and things of that nature. And then when the private sector is trying to build out market rate apartments, giving them a tax break should come with, hey, listen, well, we need at least 10% of affordable housing. And that's one of the biggest things that on the planning side that I'm dealing with now, because New London is building an incredible amount of housing in such a small footprint. We're a postage stamp, and we're building a lot of housing. Over 1,000 units is in the pipeline, and some of that housing. The affordable side of it is very difficult. We're already maxed out at 23% affordable housing. And what people have a hard time understanding is that when you are, when you get to that threshold, the state starts making it a lot more difficult for developers to get the credits required to build that affordable housing because they want it spread around through the state. But we all know, Greenwich is not building it. Some of the surrounding affluent towns are not building it. But, cities like Bridgeport, Meriden, Hartford, Stamford, and New London are charged with making sure that we continue to create housing for our residents and families. And so we have to be creative at the municipal level as well. But
and Felix, Felix, we'll have to end it there, unfortunately, because we're out of time. But it's been interesting to hear from you to talk about how New London is looking to move forward. I want to thank you for joining us here on Where We Live, Director of Economic Development and Planning. And Ken Greenberg was here, urban designer and city builder, with a lot of good thoughts about how city leaders can think about the future as we get through this pandemic. Today's show produced by Tess Terrible. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Thanks for listening.